These are all excellent questions, and somebody needs to spend some more time on them. But we have to move on.
It's not fair.
It's not fair to keep being long, right? That's probably why they met daily in the right? How else are you gonna get all your questions answered? They met daily in the school of Tyrannus. Let's pray as we begin our Bible study. Heavenly Father, we are thankful for the opportunity to be here this evening and to study your word. We do ask that you would guide this time and that you would grant us a clear understanding of the book of Titus, where it comes from, and how we can glean truth from it for our own Christian experience. We pray you would guide and direct this study this evening in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, it's been a while since we started Titus and then didn't meet again for at least 2 or 3 months. So what have we seen so far in our study of Titus? Well, the book of Titus, we called it the right leader and the right church. The right leader and the right church. On the first night of our study, I did a couple of things. The first thing I did was I looked at the place of Titus in the Bible. It was part of the pastoral epistles. And we spent quite a bit of time kind of talking about that. Now, I did that because when I taught 1 Timothy, I spent some time on the pastorals with you. Well, it's been over 20 years since we looked at 1 Timothy. So I went back over the pastoral epistles with you, why we call them the pastoral epistles, the reason behind that, and I discussed that on the first night. And so we focused on the pastoral epistles. The second thing we did was we looked at the recipient of the book of Titus. And obviously the recipient is Titus. And so I looked at Titus in the canon, and he wasn't in the canon a lot. One of the things that we talked about was when you look at the epistles, it's pretty clear that Titus is with Paul in the book of Acts on his journeys. But Luke doesn't mention him. Why, we don't know. But there are a few places, and so we looked at Titus in the canon, where he's talked about in the Bible. But we spent more time on Titus and the Corinthians, because that's where we learn the most about Titus outside of the book of Titus, is in Corinth, because Paul refers to Titus several times in reference to the Corinthians, particularly in the second epistle that he wrote to them. He mentions Titus a few times there, and so we looked at Titus in that regard. And so that was part one of our introduction. Let's continue our introduction as we get acclimated to the book of Titus. I hope you've been reading it. I know it's been quite a while, but I've been reading it and hope you've been reading the book of Titus. So let's begin tonight by looking at the historical background. My pen is kind of acting funny. I may need to get this replaced, Pastor Pat. The historical background of Titus. All right, that's where we're going to start this evening. Now, in thinking through the historical background, let's first talk about the island of Crete itself. Where was the island of Crete? Yes, the island of Crete was in the middle of the Mediterranean. Now this is the map from our third missionary journey, Paul's third missionary journey, and you can see Crete there. Notice on the right-hand side of the map you have Cyprus. Cyprus was the island that Paul and Barnabas visited on their first missionary journey. As you move west from Cyprus, you run into Crete. Crete is in the mouth of the Aegean Sea. You see the Aegean Sea in the in the northwest corner of the map, in between Asia and on the right-hand side, and Macedonia and Achaia on the left-hand side. Asia, of course, is Turkey today. That's Turkey. Macedonia and Achaia, that's Greece. And so in between Greece and Turkey is the Aegean Sea. We're going to hear a lot about that in the third missionary journey. They go back and forth across the Aegean Sea. Crete is almost in the mouth of that. It's just south of the Greek mainland, the island of Crete. Now, as to the size of this island, it was approximately 160 miles long. You see how long it is, very long and thin, isn't it? About 160 miles long, and it varied between 7 and 35 miles wide. At some points it's 7 miles, at some points it's as far as 35 miles. Now, there were 3 major mountain ranges on this island. Now, an island that small with three major mountain ranges means that not a lot of it was habitable. Right? Not a lot of it was habitable, and that is the case. Crete was populated, however, from the 4th millennium BC by farmers, and its most famous inhabitants came in the 3rd millennium BC, and that was the Minoan civilization. Those of you who can remember back to grade school, I'm sure you can't, I can't, but you may have read the Iliad and the Odyssey by Homer. Well, one of the main characters in the Homeric epics is King Minor, and King Minor is from the island of Crete. He is Minoan in his background. Now, the island of Crete was captured in between 68 and 66 BC by the Romans. And the Romans made it part of the North African province of Cyrenaica. Now, in the bottom of the map, that little beige area, that's North Africa. And so Crete was considered as part of North Africa, all right, in the Roman geographical layer. This is how the Romans organized this part of the world. So that's Crete. Now, how did the church get to Crete? Well, we don't know how the church got to Crete. It's hard to find the origins of the church. Now, we do know that there were Cyrenians at the day of Pentecost. So in Acts 2, verse 11, Luke mentions people from Cyrenia. Now, what he doesn't mention was, were they from Crete or were they from the mainland? We don't know where they were from. All right, so what that leaves us with is speculating that the gospel got to Crete through Paul and Titus. And so Paul probably took the gospel to Crete. That's all that we can say with any level of confidence. The church is there by the time, obviously, but we would argue that probably Paul and Titus very well may have started the church there on the island of Crete.
But it wasn't part of either the first, second, or third journey?
No, it wasn't part of the first, second, or third journey. Yeah. So let's look next at the dating of Titus.
Can you switch out the PowerPoint?
I'm sorry?
Can you switch out the PowerPoint?
Oh, yeah, it's still showing PowerPoint. Okay, let me. Here we go. Let's move next to the dating of Titus. The dating of Titus. Now, when we did the pastoral epistles earlier, I dated them. So obviously that's, again, years and years ago. So I'm going to kind of review how we get the dates of 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, and Titus. How do we date these 3 epistles? How do we know when they were written? All right, so let's review. 1 Timothy. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to refer you to the facts that we know. All right? I'm going to go through each of the three letters, refer you to the facts that we know, and then at the end, I'm going to use those facts to come up with a date. So, first, 1 Timothy. Here are the facts that we know. Number one, we know it was written by Paul sometime after he had left Ephesus on the way to Macedonia. That's 1 Timothy 1, verse 3. 1 Timothy 1, verse 3. It was written by Paul sometime after he left Ephesus on his way to Macedonia. Number two, on his way to Macedonia, he left Timothy at Ephesus to do some further work there. Again, that's 1 Timothy chapter 1, verse 3 again. So Paul leaves Ephesus, goes to Macedonia, and he leaves Timothy in Ephesus. Thirdly, Paul did not expect to be away from Ephesus too long. He intended to rejoin Timothy. That's chapter 3, verses 14 and 15. So Paul intended to go back to Ephesus after spending time in Macedonia. Okay? So those are the facts that we know about 1 Timothy. Let's move to 2 Timothy. What do we know about 2 Timothy? Well, the first thing we know is that Paul was in prison when he wrote that book. Chapter 1, verse 8. So he was in prison on account of the gospel. Secondly, Paul said he was deserted of support during that time. Okay, that's chapter 1, verse 15. He was deserted. Number 3, Paul's imprisonment was in Rome. He was in Rome when he was in prison. And it was there that some of the family of Onesiphorus found him and refreshed him, according to chapter 1, verse 16. So he was in Rome, and some people that Timothy knows found him in Rome and refreshed him in Rome. Chapter 1, verse 16. Fourthly, this imprisonment was a difficult imprisonment. Paul refers to its difficulty. Chapter 1, verse 8. Chapter 2, verse 3. Chapter 2, verses 9 through 10. It was a difficult imprisonment. Fifthly, Paul expected to die. Paul expected he was going to die. This was the end for Paul as he understood his life. We see that in chapter 4, verses 6 through 8. The sixth thing I want you to see about 2 Timothy is that Timothy was not in Rome with Paul, but Paul asked him to come to Rome. Okay, Timothy was not in Rome. Paul asked him to come to Rome. We see that in chapter 4, verse 9. Titus, according to chapter 4, verse 10, Titus was in Rome, but had made his way to Dalmatia. So he was in Rome for a while, but he's made his way to Dalmatia. So if he was in Rome, where could he not be? On Crete, right? We're going to piece all this together. So if he was in Rome and is going to Dalmatia, he couldn't be in Crete, where he was left. Right? So that kind of tells you the difference between 2 Timothy and Titus. All right, also, Luke was with Paul in Rome, and Paul asked Timothy to bring Mark with him. That's chapter 4, verse 11. So Luke was already there. Paul wanted Timothy to come, and he wanted him to bring Mark along. The ninth thing that we see in 2 Timothy is that Tychicus was being sent to Ephesus, no doubt with this letter, apparently to relieve Timothy so he could make his way to Rome. That's chapter 4, verse 12. So Tychicus was on the way to Timothy. Why? Well, Paul wanted Timothy to come to Rome. So Tychicus was going to replace Timothy in Ephesus and send Timothy to Rome. Something else that we know about this letter, Timothy according to chapter 4, verse 13, Timothy was to pass through Troas to pick up some personal items for Paul, his cloak. Apparently it was winter, his cloak and his parchments. Parchments would have been copies of the Bible. That's chapter 4, verse 13. So Timothy, on the way to Rome, needed to stop in Troas, pick up Paul's cloak and his parchments, and then come to Rome. Two more items. We also see that one of his traveling companions, I'm sorry, I skipped a point. Verse 16 of chapter 4, Paul's first Roman defense was a lonely one, as there was no one there to support him. So could this be Paul's first imprisonment in Rome? Couldn't be. So whatever's going on in 2 Timothy is not his first imprisonment in Rome. Another point that we see is one of his traveling companions, Trophimus, had taken sick in Miletus while on his way to Rome. So one of his traveling companions was on his way to Rome and had become sick. Then in chapter 4, verse 13, winter time was quickly coming, and Paul wanted Timothy to arrive there before the winter. So it wasn't the winter yet, but the winter was coming, and Paul wanted Timothy get here before the winter. Okay, it could be because of the cloak issue that he wanted him to pick up. So that's 2 Timothy. Now let's go to Titus. What do we know about Titus? Well, the first thing we know is that Paul had been doing some missionary work on the island of Crete. That's chapter 1, verse 5. So whatever's going on, whenever it was written, Paul had just finished ministry on Crete with Titus. Number 2, when Paul moved on from Crete, he left Titus there to establish elders in the churches. Again, that's chapter 1, verse 5 of Titus. A third point we see in chapter 3, verse 12, is that Artemas or Tychicus were sent by Paul to relieve Titus and indicate that Titus was to make his way to Nicopolis, where Paul decided to spend the winter. So Paul was going to relieve Titus. Titus was then to travel to Nicopolis. Why? Because Paul was going to spend the winter in Nicopolis. That's two mentions of winter. I don't know if you caught that. In 2 Timothy it mentions winter. Winter's coming. And then in Titus it mentions, I'm going to spend the winter in Nicopolis. And he wanted Titus to meet him there. Also, verse 13 of chapter 3 of Titus, Zenas and Apollos were sent with Artemas and Tychicus, and Titus was to help them reach the destination to which they were headed. So these two men, Zenas and Apollos, were going to do ministry somewhere else. And so they were coming along. Titus was to help them to go to where they were going to go to. Obviously, he was to raise funds for them in the churches of Crete so they could be sent on their way to wherever they were headed. Now, let's take all that and come up with some dates. Okay? First off, 2 Timothy was the last of Paul's letters, written just before he was martyred in Rome after he was imprisoned for some length of time there. Okay? As 2 Timothy chapter 4, verses 6 through 8 demonstrated, Paul had no hope of being released. All right? He would die as a martyr. History tells us that he died under the Emperor Nero. Nero was the emperor at the time that killed Paul. Now, why is that important? Nero committed suicide June of AD 68. So whenever Paul was killed, it was prior to that. So 2 Timothy was written prior to AD 68. Because Nero, who killed Paul, committed suicide himself June of 68. Now, given the fact that Paul had done some further ministry in Ephesus and the historical events that ensued do not fit in the book of Acts, the events in 1 Timothy and therefore 2 Timothy take place after the Roman imprisonment in Acts 28. So Paul is imprisoned in Acts 28. That's how the book of Acts ends. We cannot find any of the travels that Paul mentions in 1 and 2 Timothy in the book of Acts. We can't find them there. So we argue that whatever events took place in 1 and 2 Timothy happened after the book of Acts. So Paul is imprisoned in Acts 28, and he eventually is released. Now, this makes sense because if you read Ephesians, Colossians, and Philippians, Paul expects to be released from prison. It's not like 2 Timothy. In 2 Timothy, Paul says, I'm dying. This is it. That's not the case in the other letters written while he's in prison. They're written during his first imprisonment in Rome, in Acts 28. Paul expected to get out, and he was released. When he was released from prison, he did some more traveling. That's where 1 and 2 Timothy and the geographical places mentioned there, that's where they fit in. So Acts 28, Paul is released. He travels some more, does some more ministry in Ephesus, in Crete, and so on. And then he's rearrested again and finds himself in prison in Rome a second time. That's the second imprisonment is where 2 Timothy is written from. So, where does that leave us? Your guess is as good as mine, right? So, Nero dies in 68 AD. Paul then must have been martyred sometime between 66 and 67. So Paul is martyred at that time. Titus was therefore likely penned. Remember, he's not in prison yet. Let me erase some of this from our question and answer period, sorry. So Titus is probably written sometime between 64 and 65 AD. A year prior to 2 Timothy. 1 year prior to 2 Timothy. Now, why do we say 1 year? That's pretty specific. Well, the reason we argue 1 year is because, first off, in 2 Timothy, a winter is approaching. So Paul is saying to Timothy, Paul is saying to Titus to come. Why? Because the winter is coming, and he plans to spend the winter in Nicopolis. Right? Paul is imprisoned in Rome awaiting his execution in 2 Timothy, and while there he was a free man just, okay, I'm kind of mixed up here, I'm sorry, I read the wrong line here. Why do we say there's a 1 year difference between 2 Timothy and Titus? Because in 2 Timothy, a winter is quickly approaching, and in Titus, Paul had made the decision to spend the winter in Nicopolis. So in 2 Timothy, winter's coming. In Titus, he's going to spend winter in Nicopolis. So that's why we argue there's a year difference between 2 Timothy and Titus. 2 Timothy, winter's coming. Titus, I'm going to spend the winter in Nicopolis, meet me there. All right, so he's not in prison in Titus. All right, so that's why we say there's at least a year difference between Titus and 2 Timothy. Paul was a prisoner in Rome waiting for his execution in 2 Timothy while he was a free man having left Crete in the book of Titus. 1 Timothy also predates 2 Timothy because in 1 Timothy, Paul is freely moving around carrying on his ministry. So with those things in mind, how would we date these books? We would date these books as 1 and 2 Timothy, 1 Timothy and Titus were written sometime between 63 and 64 AD. So 1 Timothy and Titus. And then 2 Timothy was written sometime between AD 65 and 66. And all that seemed a little bit complicated. That's basically how we have to date these books. We have to date these books by what we know is going on in other places. So 1 and 2 Timothy, Paul writes them between 63 and 64 AD. 2 Timothy, he writes between 65 and 66 AD. He's then martyred by Nero, who then kills himself in 68 AD. So that's the dates of the pastoral epistles. Any questions on the dates? Yes.
Should those supersede what you gave out for the book of Acts? They're a little bit different.
Well, these events are happening after the book of Acts.
I know, but you've already put that stuff on the book of Acts sheet.
I'd have to look at that.
They don't conflict. This is more focused.
Okay.
This is broader, you have a broader date.
Broader date, okay. Yeah, this is more focused. All right. So that's the date.
When did you say, excuse me, that Nero got killed that Nero killed Paul? What date was that?
So probably 66 to 67 AD. He was martyred. Because he was martyred, obviously, before he committed suicide, before Nero killed himself.
That Nero committed suicide.
68 AD, June. Yes.
How did you get specific with the month?
History. Yeah, the Romans kept a wonderful, accurate dating of these type of things. Yeah. All right, so that's the date. Let's move next to our next heading, which is the purpose. Why was Titus written? Why was Titus written? Well, fortunately for us, we don't have to look very hard or to read very far into this letter to ascertain the purpose for which Paul penned this epistle. After his greeting and salutation, notice how Paul opened up this epistle in chapter 1, verse 5. In chapter 1, verse 5, we have the following. For this reason I left you in Crete, that you might set in order what remains and appoint elders in every city as I directed you. What two purposes do you see here that Paul had for Timothy? What was Timothy supposed to do? Excuse me? Go ahead.
To set up the church and the elders?
So he was to set up the church. So that's one thing he was supposed to do. He was supposed to set up the church. So that's a very general, broad assignment. And then what was the more specific assignment he was given? To appoint elders. And so we have both a general and a specific intention for Titus. And the purpose of the book of Titus was to prepare Titus to do those two things. So those two things that Paul wanted Titus to do are prepped for him in this book, in this letter. And this letter, by following through on it, by reading it and doing what it says, Titus will accomplish the task for which he was left. So the purpose of Titus is revealed to us in chapter 1, verse 5. Let's move next to a thematic overview of Titus. I'm going to have to get our tech people to look at this, because every time I write on this, it's something going on with my pen. I'm hoping it's not showing up too bad on the screen for you all. So a thematic overview of Titus. So what are the when I say the word theme, what do you think about? Theme. Main idea, okay. What else? How do you discover themes of different books of the Bible?
We've got to read the whole thing.
You got to read the whole thing. You got to read the whole thing. And what are you looking for?
Words that are repeated.
Good. So one of the ways that you determine a theme is a reoccurring idea. So as you read through the book, you keep seeing this idea come up over and over and over again. So the reoccurrence of the ideas in the book indicate that that's probably a theme of the book. There's another way you can also identify a theme. This one may not be as readily apparent. The second way you might identify a theme is if the author spends this huge amount of time on a particular subject. So maybe he hasn't repeated the subject very often, but once he starts it, he spends a long time on it. Okay? That is another way you can identify a theme. And so I want to look at some of the themes of the book of Titus. As you read the book, as you study it along with us, what are some things that you will see? Theme number 1. An orderly church. An orderly church. This is the first theme, I believe, identified in Titus, and it is related to the purpose of the statement found in Titus chapter 1, verse 5. Now, this particular theme begins with Paul reminding Titus of the characteristics of an elder in chapter 1, verses 6 through 9. So he lays out for Titus, what are the characteristics of an elder? Now, why is it important? Well, he needs to appoint elders. So what should Timothy do with this list of characteristics? What should he do with them? Yeah, use that list to select men. Right? So he needs to make sure that the people in these churches understand what an elder is. And so he needs to clearly communicate that to them, and then they use that as a template for choosing men. These elders, according to chapter 1, verses 10 through 11, will be essential in enabling the church not to stray from God's will. That's an important part of being an elder. Now, Paul's concern for an orderly church extends beyond just that, however. Paul wants various groups in the church to live a certain way. Where do we see that? Titus chapter 2, yes. Paul wants certain groups to act and live a certain way. And notice the propriety he wants exercised in church. Does he want, who does he want teaching the young women? Young guys? It's not a good thing, is it?
No.
Okay, all right. So Paul wants some kind of, let's kind of, he doesn't disallow everything, but he says, okay, let's have the older women teaching the younger women. All right. So he wants some separateness here. I wouldn't say that it has to always be separate, but as far as the young women are concerned, they kind of need to be sectioned off. All right. And so Paul is concerned about that. That's an orderly church. So he wants certain groups in the church, older men, older women, younger men. He wants them to live a certain way. And Paul lists for us the characteristics of each group that he wants taught and therefore lived in the congregation. All right? He's pretty clear on that. Titus must also not get caught, according to chapter 3, verses 9 through 10, in controversies. Okay? It's easy in the church, is it not, to get involved in controversies, right? There's always something new coming down the pike. And Paul wants Timothy, don't get involved in that. Why? Because that separates the body out, doesn't it? If I'm fighting with you over everything that comes down the pike, then the church won't be unified. Right? And so Paul is concerned about that idea. And so all of that goes under an orderly church. A church in which the leaders are, as God intended them to be, living a certain way, leading the church in a certain way, that the groups in the church are functioning properly and appropriately with each other, are maturing in those areas that older women, younger women, older men, younger men are supposed to be functioning, and that there's unity in the church and not focused on controversy. So that's one of the themes of the book of Titus. Look at another theme. I guess your pen is not working with my computer, so appreciate the thought, though, Pastor Pat. Theme number 2. A sound faith. A sound faith. I don't know if you see it in this one, but this is actually 2 themes in one. All right, there's actually 2 themes here. The first theme in this second theme is doctrine, faith, doctrine. This is an important point in the book of Titus. The leadership must be concerned with soundness in doctrine. That's the second idea. So one idea is doctrine, and the second idea is soundness in doctrine. So God wants people who are committed to doctrine, and that doctrine should be sound. All right, so those are 2 themes in one. Now, I want to spend a couple of minutes here on this idea of sound. What does he mean by sound? Sound. This is the Greek word What does that sound like? What does that sound like to you? Excuse me? Yeah, this is the Greek word from which we get the English word. Hygiene. Sound doctrine. Hygieneo. What is sound doctrine? It's healthy doctrine. Right? It's healthy. It's healthy. This phrase, watch this, occurs 5 times in this short letter. 5 times. This lets us know that doctrinal health is a critical part of church life. A healthy church is a doctrinally sound church. Now, most people don't base their view of health in a church on doctrine, right? You know plenty of people who the first thing they look at to evaluate whether they're going to come to a church is, well, do they have, what does the kids program look like? What type of activities do they have? Is there a choir there? What is praise and worship like? But in Titus, again, remember, Paul is describing for him what a church should be like. And what Paul is concerned about is healthy doctrine. All right, you want to make sure that the doctrine is sound and healthy in the church. This type of healthy doctrine will be manifested in both correction and in exhortation. In chapter 1, verse 13, Paul says, this testimony is true. For this cause reprove them severely so that they may be sound in the faith. So Paul says, if they're going to be sound in the faith, you got to bring the wood, right? Reprove them severely, he said. Wow, strong language, Paul. Look at chapter 2, verse 1. But as for you, speak the things which are fitting for sound doctrine. And then he talks about older men and older women, younger men. All that is an outgrowth of sound doctrine. You won't know what you're supposed to be as a woman or a man is concerned without sound doctrine. That's where it begins. All right? It begins there. It doesn't end there. All right? This makes it clear that sound doctrine does not just mean thinking right, but here in Titus, we also see that it means living right. That means life founded upon healthy doctrine. Life founded upon healthy doctrine. So that's another theme in the book of Titus, a sound faith. Let's look at a third theme. I keep grabbing Pat's pen. The third one, Christian purity. Christian purity. This fascinated me. When I'm doing my studies in prepping a book, I read through it. Of course, this week after week, I just read through it every day just read through it, and then I begin doing searches on different words and so on. Paul uses 3 different words for pure in this book. I found that fascinating. He uses 3 different Greek words that all mean pure. So Paul is clearly examining this concept of purity. He's turning it on its different side, and he's looking at what purity is and how it manifests itself in the life of the church. Paul examined the various nuances of purity. First off, he emphasized this as a distinguishing characteristic that separates believers from unbelievers in Titus 1 verse 15. So purity is one of the things that distinguishes unconverted people from converted people. Purity sets them apart from each other. This is really important to Paul, especially in this context, because the people in Crete, they were some messed up folk. I mean, when you read the first chapter, Paul says they even say of themselves that they messed up. I mean, there's some rough people on Crete, right? And so this issue of purity really separates the groups from each other. Purity also manifests itself in the familial division of Titus. In Titus chapter 2, where he's talking about older men, older women, younger women, purity appears in that context as well, indicating that purity has a role in the Christian to Christian relationship. our Christian relationships with each other should be marked by purity. All right? We shouldn't be trying to take advantage of each other in inappropriate ways in the church. Of course, some churches are known for that, sadly, but we don't want to be known for that. Also, we see that, by the way, in chapter 2, verse 5. By the time we reach Paul's exposition of grace in Titus 2, it's no surprise to see in chapter 2, verse 14, that believers were reminded that purity was part of the divine intention in conversion. God saved us to be pure. He saved us to be pure. So, purity distinguishes us from unsaved people. It should define our interpersonal relationships with each other. Why? Because God has ordained us to be people of purity. And so Paul talks about purity extensively in this particular book. Another key aspect of the Christian life that Paul turned to on a number of occasions here was Christian submission. Christian submission. In the familial division of this book, chapter 2, verses 1 through 10, we see this idea come up twice, both as a defining characteristic of the wife's relationship with the husband in chapter 2, verse 5, as well as the relationships of slaves with masters in chapter 2, verse 9. This really parallels Paul's description of submission in the book of Ephesians, which was written, of course, before this one. But the concept here is that submission defines the Christian life. Why? Because it's a Christian norm that believers submit to those whose authority that they're under. So authority, relationships of authority demand submission. Relationships of authority demand submission. In other words, this is not a wife thing, like the world. So all you're concerned about is the wife submitting. No, we're concerned with everybody submitting. Look at Titus chapter 3, verse 1. Remind them, listen to Paul, remind them, who's the them? The believers on Crete. Remind them to be subject, see that? To rulers, to authorities, to be obedient, to be ready for every good deed. So Paul wants submission, wives to husbands, slaves to masters, but then he wants submission everybody. If whatever authority relationship you're in, you need to be submission. You need to be in submission to the one under whose authority you are. So that's one of the themes we find in the book of Titus. Probably the theme that I found most interesting, because I think that this theme dominates this book like no other theme, is good deeds. You may not have been expecting that one. Good deeds. Now, we have one of the most critical statements of good deeds in Ephesians chapter 2, verse 10. There we read, "For we are his workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works, good deeds, which God prepared beforehand that we should walk in them." What I find interesting is that in a book as short as Titus, that we have more direct references and instructions on good deeds than in any of Paul's other writings. Interesting. Here we see, I believe, one of the primary points of importance to this letter. Well, why is this letter so? Why did God have this letter in the Bible? Why did he choose this one? Well, good deeds is a theme that is discussed here more than anywhere else. Good deeds are a defining quality of the Christian life, much like the characteristic of purity is. Just as the deeds of the unsaved bear witness to their lack of conversion, the deeds of the saved bear witness to their conversion. I want to compare two verses with you. Titus 1 verse 16 and Titus 2 verse 14. Just listen to these two verses. First, verse 16 of chapter 1. They profess to know God, but by their deeds they deny him, being detestable and disobedient and worthless for any good deed. Then chapter 2 verse 14. Who gave himself for us that he might redeem us from every lawless deed and purify, hey, there's our word again, for himself a people for his own possession, zealous for good deeds or good works. So this idea of good deeds really gets brought up over and over again in the book of Titus. It's one of the things that leaders are to reflect to the congregation, according to chapter 2, verse 7. And one of the things that they should define, and one of the things that should define their instruction to the congregation needs to be instructed to do good deeds. We see this in chapter 3, verse 1, chapter 3, verse 8, chapter 3, verse 14. Good deeds, good deeds, good deeds. It's something that should define us as Christians, people who practice good deeds. So here then we see some of the unique themes about this book of Titus. This lets us know one of the reasons God selected this letter to be included in his instruction to his people. The final thing I want to look at this evening is the outline, a general outline of the book. I'm having so much trouble with my pen. I'm just gonna say them, and hopefully by next week I'll have my pen in a better shape and we'll be able to get through this easier. So his first section is his salutation. His salutation. That's chapter 1, verse 1 through verse 4. The salutation. Now, this is a very interesting salutation. We're going to spend a long time on it, so just get ready. All right? It's a very interesting salutation. It's different than other salutations that Paul has in his letters, and so we're going to try to figure out why it's so different. The second part, or the second division of this book, I've entitled The Mission of Titus. The mission of Titus. And that's chapter 1, verse 5 through chapter 3, verse 11. The mission of Titus. Chapter 1, verse 5 through chapter 3, verse 11. Three major points under this heading, the mission of Titus. Point number A, the assignment stated. The assignment stated. That's chapter 1, verse 5. The assignment stated. Number B point, the establishment of local church leadership. The establishment of local church leadership. That's chapter 1, verse 6 through 16. Chapter 1, verses 6 through 16. The establishment of local church leadership. And then C point, or number 3 here, the establishment of order within the community. The establishment of order within the community. That's chapter 2, verse 1 through chapter 3, verse 11. The establishment of order within the community. Chapter 2, verse 1 through chapter 3, verse 11. Then the third major division. So we move from the salutation to the mission of Titus, and then thirdly, the conclusion. The conclusion. Chapter 3, verses 12 through 14. The conclusion. And then Roman numeral number 4, the greeting. The greeting, chapter 3, verse 15. There was some more that I wanted to say about the outline, but so we can finish on time, that's why I kind of shortened it and just gave you the outline. But I just kind of wanted to walk you through it a little bit, but that's okay. We'll walk through this over the next few days. So the greeting. So the four major points are the salutation, chapter 1, verses 1 through 4, the mission of Titus, chapter 1, verse 5 through chapter 3, verse 11, the conclusion, chapter 3, verses 12 through 14, and the greeting, chapter 3, verse 15. Any questions? Yes. So the conclusion was chapter 3, verses 12 through 14.
When Paul was talking about the slaves,
Yes.
in the second chapter, verse 9.
Yes.
Now, is this the first century? I'm just trying to understand, when he's talking about slaves, is he talking about the slaves of Christ? Or is he talking about,
Yeah, that's a bad translation. He's talking about slaves. Talking about Roman slaves.
Romans?
Yeah. Christians who were slaves.
So they still have slavery.
Oh yeah. They're going to have slavery for many centuries after this point. Yeah. So, yeah, so slavery was an active part of the Roman Empire. Yeah. All right. Would you like to have communion? Would you like to have communion? We're going to allow the Perkins to have communion this evening as we close.